any problems with anyone coming in. My name is Jackie with Hub City, and I am here with Rosy and Julie, and I am so happy to welcome them both to a virtual event with us. We're very grateful for them joining us. Just so you know, Julie is going to be doing a little bit of translating for Rosy, so we'll just allow a little pause after I speak if we need to translate or after Rosy speaks. And if anyone has any questions, please ask them in the chat window, and me or Julie will voice them and we'll get everybody's questions answered. We would love a lot of really great questions, so feel free to ask anything you have in mind. A quick bio for Rosy. Rosayra Pablo Cruz is the mother of 4 children. She owned a small clothing store in Guatemala before coming to the United States. Now living in New York, she is the co-chair of her oldest son's Parent-Teacher Association and is active in her church and community. Julie Schwietert Collazo is a bilingual English-Spanish writer, editor, and translator, and former creative arts therapist. She has co-written and edited a book on Pope Francis, which has been translated into more than a dozen languages and is a bestseller in Italy. Her work has been featured in various media outlets, including Outside, Scientific American, Discover, Latina, The Guardian, and Time, and she has contributed to several books. She also lives in New York. And again, thank you both for joining us from there. And we can't wait to hear what you have to say about this lovely book.
Thank you, Jackie. Rosy, ella le dice que está dando la bienvenida a los compañeros y compañeras y está invitando preguntas de todos. Y les voy a decir que realmente no hay un límite en las preguntas, ¿verdad? Que estamos muy abiertas y si no queremos contestar, la vamos a decir. Thank you so much for having both of us tonight. I was just saying to Rosy, and we wanted to let you know that we really are both very open, and so there are no questions that are off limits, whether personal or political, social. So feel free to be very open in your own questioning. We'll let you know if for some reason we don't want to answer it, but we haven't had that situation yet. So I thought that we might begin, unless Jackie, you wanted to start with your questions. Since we're on the eve of the inauguration, I thought that I might ask Rosy a little bit. We've talked a bit in some other Zoom meetings, and she and I have talked a little bit privately about her hopes for the incoming administration. But I think I wanted to ask her a little bit more directly about how she's feeling on the eve of the inauguration and what it means to her, especially as somebody who was granted asylum in February of 2020. I think I often say that folks who are waiting for an asylum decision are in this really strange, and she says this too in the book, are in this really strange period of limbo where they're very eager to set down roots here and begin building a life and really find their place in the community. And that becomes really difficult when you don't have a decision from an immigration judge yet that establishes whether you're allowed to continue living here. And so now that she is, I thought we might start with that question, if that's okay. Entonces, Rosy, vamos a empezar. Estamos en la víspera de la inauguración del nuevo presidente. Y lo que queríamos preguntarle primero es si cómo se siente actualmente en esta noche, porque mañana habrá un cambio muy grande y especialmente como ya recibió el asilo en el año pasado, ya forma parte de esta comunidad americana, el sueño americano. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que está esperando, no solamente mañana, pero en los próximos 4 años?
Primero que nada, buenas noches y gracias por estar aquí. Gracias por compartir con nosotros. Bueno, yo siento que este cambio es algo muy positivo y realmente lo que espero de esta nueva etapa de gobierno es la inclusión, ¿sí?, de nuestra comunidad hispana, que desempeña un papel muy importante en este país. Somos una comunidad de que como en todo, hay bueno y malo. Sin embargo, la mayoría que yo he conocido, me he dado cuenta que todos tenemos como un propósito y el propósito es una mejor vida. Esa mejor vida solo la alcanzamos con esfuerzo. Y lamentablemente en nuestros países no hay la oportunidad de un trabajo digno. Por lo mismo, la comunidad busca ese sentido de superación en otros lugares como lo es este país. Y pues eso espero un poco más de inclusión de la comunidad hispana, y al decir hispana no solo estoy hablando de los países de Centroamérica, estoy hablando de todas las personas que vienen con esa necesidad de encontrar un mejor futuro en este país. Entonces sí, yo por ahora estoy, bueno, ya graduada de una capacitación para capacitadoras, trabajadoras del hogar, y es de National Domestic Worker, que somos mujeres que estamos empoderándonos para hacer valer nuestro trabajo. Entonces, más que nada es como el respeto hacia este tipo de trabajo, porque todos los trabajos son esenciales, no importando si tuvimos una educación académica o simplemente en nuestro hogar. Pero es para nosotros muy importante eso, la inclusión de nuestra comunidad, el respeto, básicamente. Eso es lo único que pedimos. Y eso es lo que espero de este gobierno nuevo.
Gracias. Rosy says, good evening, and thank you for being here. She said that she feels that this change in administration feels overall very positive to her. And what she hopes for in the new administration is greater inclusion, especially for the Latinx community, which she says is an important part of this country. And she said, we're all important. Unfortunately, our countries don't offer opportunities for health, safety, growth. So we look for that elsewhere. She was also sharing that in the past year, she graduated from a training program that was sponsored by the National Domestic Workers Association. And through that, she had the opportunity to meet many women who, like her, are seeking training, support, and above all, respect. So what she's hoping for, above all in the Biden-Harris administration, is increased respect, tolerance and inclusion, and visibility to be seen, to be acknowledged, and to be included in the pursuit of the American dream. I wanted to ask her a follow-up question. One of the reports that came out today had, to me, what was a really interesting paragraph. Biden announced that on the first day of his administration, he intends to propose sweeping immigration reforms. And one of the reforms that was mentioned, although not in great detail, was about root causes of migration, which is something that I'm really interested in and passionate about, and which, frankly, immigration policy in the United States has never addressed adequately. And so one of the questions that I have for her is what she hopes to see in this administration with respect to the Biden-Harris administration reaching out to communities, countries, especially in Central America, in terms of addressing root causes of migration there. Rosy, me gustaría preguntarle, en cuanto política concreta de la nueva administración, hoy la administración de Biden anunció que mañana es su intención de proponer una política nueva de manera muy abarcadora que ofrece reformas extensas, ¿no? Y alguna de las cosas que mencionó es que tiene la intención de proponer reformas que tocan el tema de las causas de migración. Cosas que usted y yo hemos hablado, y también en el libro hablamos del impacto, por ejemplo, del cambio climático, ¿no? Entonces, en cuanto a cosas muy concretas, en cuanto a las cosas que tiene que ver con las causas principales de la migración. ¿Qué es lo que le gustaría ver de la administración acerca de este tema?
Bueno, acerca de este tema sí me gustaría las alianzas, podría decir de gobierno a gobierno, en los diferentes países, como en mi país, que es Guatemala, y el gobierno de Estados Unidos, para poder dar esas capacitaciones, esos soportes a las comunidades y evitar esas migraciones masivas que ahora se están dando. Creo que sería una de las formas como ayudar. Sin embargo, tocando temas de gobierno, son temas muy difíciles, porque pues los gobiernos en nuestros países, en mi país más que nada, no son muy transparentes, que digamos. Entonces, sería más factible como en organizaciones que pudieran dar este tipo de capacitación a nuestra comunidad, y de esta manera evitar esta migración masiva que está pasando en estos tiempos. Sí, también pienso que el apoyo hacia la apertura de mercados, de la importación de productos, esto también abriría como un gran apoyo a la comunidad, que la comunidad tuviera esa oportunidad de poder exportar sus productos. Siento que sería una forma de ayudarse mutuamente, porque entonces este país no llega a una sobrepoblación, que no es lo que se quiere, y nuestros países reciben el apoyo que necesitan, porque pues es difícil en nuestro país trabajar por 50 quetzales al día, y cuando solo en una comida uno está gastando de 75 a 100 quetzales. Entonces estamos hablando de un desequilibrio, pero sería una de las cosas que sí me gustaría, ese tipo de apoyo más abierto hacia la comunidad para evitar pues las migraciones masivas.
Bueno, yo le nombro asesora al presidente, entonces. Sí, yo creo que tiene mucha razón. Rosy says that what she would like to see concretely in terms of policies to address root causes of migration to the United States include better sharing of resources and training opportunities, although she acknowledges that this is a challenge because governments are complicated entities. And in the case of the government of Guatemala, she says it's not especially a transparent government, that problems with corruption really preclude the kind of collaborative relationships that would be most helpful at the ground level. She also believes that reviewing trade accords and specifically related to exports from Central America are an important part of improving root causes of migration, because of the problem of people not being able to make a viable living in Central America. And she also really wanted to underscore that the goal is never for one country, specifically the recipient country of migrants, to become overpopulated, but really for every person in an ideal scenario to be able to have the ability to live. So she would like to see, as I would certainly add, that in terms of approaching a government policy that's really aimed at root causes of migration, that we're looking at the opportunities to build shared futures and to really see our futures as tied together. If you've read the book, one of the things that she's also mentioned, and she and I talk about this a lot in numerous contexts, is also the impact of climate change. And so really looking at things like rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, really making serious, strong commitments to environmental integrity and environmental protection are important to us here in the United States, but they have massive trickle-down effects all over the rest of the world. And certainly she has seen that personally in Guatemala with the coffee blight, problems related to agriculture in her own lifetime. she's witnessed massive changes. And a lot of the migration out of Guatemala specifically is related to the farming practices that can no longer be carried out there. And so really viewing immigration as an issue that is intersectional is something that she believes is very important. So Rosy and I actually talk all the time. So maybe we'll see if you have any questions. I know Jackie also has some questions that she'd like to ask. And then if you do, that would be great. And if you don't, then she and I, we're really good at talking for long periods of time. So we're fine either way. Jackie, do you want to start with your questions, and then folks can drop their questions in the chat?
Yeah, I love that you two stay in touch so closely. And Julie was telling me where Rosy was before the event and just like how much they talk, and I absolutely love that. And there is a comment that I'll read aloud from Trevor, which we really appreciate. Rosayra and Julie, you are my heroes for living and telling your story. Gracias, I see you. Estoy aquí, and I'm with you. I thought that was really nice. Thank you for leaving a comment for them. I have a couple of questions, mostly just about how this lovely book came about. I love that it came out in English and Spanish at the same time. And I think that must have been really important for you and Rosy to make sure that it was accessible to everyone who might want to read it. Can you talk a little bit about how you wrote this together? Like, did you have different parts that you each wrote? Did Rosy tell the story and you kind of translated it and wrote it for her? How did that partnership work?
Rosy, voy a platicar un momento sobre el proceso de la publicación del libro. So it was really interesting how this all came about. I'll tell you a little bit of the backstory on the process. I'm a very process-oriented person, so I love talking about this piece of it. I have a literary agent who saw an article that the New York Times did about immigrant families together in, I think, July of 2018. So we were only a few weeks old at that point. We actually, I think we made up the name for the New York Times. We didn't have a name beforehand. And Scott, my agent, called me and he said, look, you know, you need to write a book proposal about this, right? And I sort of banged one out and sent it to him and didn't hear anything from him. And I kind of, he scares me a little bit because we're very, very different personalities and we're really good for each other in that way. He more so for me than me for him. But he's a very like pragmatic, like only interested in things that sell. He's, after the Pope Francis book came out, which has its own weird backstory, he called me and he said, let's get together and have lunch and you can tell me your other book ideas. And I went with like 5 ideas and he's like, no, none of those are going to sell. You just can't even write about those things if you're going to be on my literary roster. And so I kind of tucked my tail between my legs and went home and didn't get in touch with him for a year. And then he gets in touch with me about this. And so I sent in the proposal, don't hear from him for months. And I figured I'm not going to chase this down. If something comes of it, he'll get in touch with me. And if nothing comes of it, then that's okay too, because I'm really busy and I'm not really sure I have time to write a book. And then in October, I want to say, of 2018, he calls me up and he says, do you know who Pitbull is? And I said, yes. And if you don't know who Pitbull is, he is a Cuban-American rapper whose nickname is Mr. Worldwide and has gazillions of followers and $1 gazillion. And he said, well, Pitbull has a contract to write a memoir, but he keeps overshooting his deadline. So his original publisher is dropping his book and it's going to auction and they want to know if you would be interested in translating it. And I said, yes, I would be interested in translating it. And he said, okay, great. I'm meeting with Judith Kerr, the president of Harper One tomorrow, and I'll let her know. I said, okay, great. And he calls me back the next day and he says, I met with Judith, and he mentions nothing about Pitbull. And he says, and I presented the proposal to her and she's really interested, but she says, and they were both totally right about this, that it really needs to be a book that is centered on one person's story. And I said, well, that makes total sense to me, but I really don't want to choose one person because I feel like that's really problematic from an organizational level. And he said, well, just talk me through some people's stories. And so we talked about different stories and he said, Rosy's is the one that I think is really representative of what you want to explain to people, what you want to share with people in a book. And so from there, it just went really quickly. But I will say, Jackie, you're so right. It's very rare for books to be published simultaneously in English and Spanish in the United States. If a translation of a book comes out, it's usually a couple of years, if not longer, afterward. And Harper One, who was the publisher in English, and HarperCollins Español, which is the Spanish publisher, have been really amazing throughout this entire process. Everything from the planning of the simultaneous publication in English and Spanish, which was very important to both of us, to really thinking, I think, being very thoughtful about the marketing of the book. Some of you may have read or been aware of the controversy around Janine Cummings' book, American Dirt, which blew up right as Rosie and I were about to go to the American Librarians Association conference last February in Philadelphia. And so the entire publishing industry was really rocked by the controversy around the book. And so we had very honest conversations with Harper One and HarperCollins Español about everything, really, about how it was important for this to really be promoted as Rosie's book, because that's what it is, right? And for her to be centered in everything. And so I think that's been, in terms of like the publishing side of this process, they've been an incredible partner, and I really don't think we could have landed with a better publisher. In terms of the actual writing process, we had a very short time to get this done. I think we signed the contract in December of 2018, and the manuscript, which was supposed to be 70,000 words, was due in March. Yeah, and between us, we have 5 kids here in the US. Well, her oldest son is now 18, but young kids. And so we really had to get things done during school hours. And also it was very important to me not to re-expose her children to her traumas pre-United States or their trauma collectively shared here. And so we were very productive in our sessions around my kitchen table. But I think also the big piece here is that Rosie is an incredible storyteller. Stories come out of her just sort of whole cloth. And so I was very fortunate as co-author that there wasn't much that I had to do. It was really sort of taking these different pieces that she said and figuring out what order made the most sense for a narrative. But in terms of, it wasn't hard. She was wonderful. And I think in a way that a lot of folks that I work with at Immigrant Families Together are not, which is not a judgment. It's just a statement that folks who are traumatized and folks who have been through immigration detention and the immigration system, their trust has been abused so many times that they are in a constant state of assessment about who is safe to share their stories with. And I think there was no reason that she necessarily had to trust me, although we were friends. But I think that she trusted me with really the most painful and profound moments and stories of her life, and was very, very generous in the telling of those stories.
Thank you. That's really lovely to hear that the publishers worked so closely with you guys and made that a priority. Also, the way that it came about as being the book of Rosie, I love the name of it. And does Rosie have any, I guess I can ask Rosie directly, but does she have any issues with it being so clearly her name in the title as well as the author?
I'll mention just something quickly about that, and then I'll ask her that. The original manuscript title, I'm terrible with titles. I hate titles. I've always felt challenged by titles. But from the beginning, our agent had a provisional title on the proposal, on the manuscript, and we got to the point where the book was literally heading off to publication. And I actually happened to be on IFT Business in San Francisco, so I met with Judith and with our English editor, Shannon Welch, at their office there. And Judith said, you know what, I don't think this is the right title for this book. The original title was Tender Mercies, which really had nothing to do with the book or what we wanted people to take away from it. but I thought from a marketing perspective, maybe somebody would get it confused with Anne Lamott's Traveling Mercies, and maybe that would be a good thing. So I also just, I didn't argue with it much, and neither did she. And Judith was sitting there and she said, you know, I think that it should be called the Book of Rosy. And everybody was like, oh, yes, because it is, but also because I think of the religious overtones or undertones of the book. And so it just felt really right. And I asked Rosy because I wasn't sure how she would feel about it. So I'll ask her again to sort of go back to that moment. Rosy, Jackie, le gustaría preguntarle cuál fue su opinión sobre el título del libro. Si se sintió cómoda o incómoda con la idea de que iba a estar tan centrada en el mismo título del libro.
Bueno, creo que, bueno, no fue incómodo para mí porque incluso en ese momento estaba como ansiosa porque todo aquello que me había pasado dentro de la detención, quería que se supiera. Entonces, mi enfoque era eso, como mostrar o hablar al respecto de lo que estaba y aún continúa pasando en este momento dentro de la detención. El título en sí no, siento que no es para mí una cosa de impacto, simplemente lo que sí necesitaba era hablar sobre todo lo que está pasando ahí adentro y apoyar a todas estas madres que no han podido hablar. Básicamente ha sido eso. Ya la decisión cuando se me dio la oportunidad de que Julie me dice que si yo quería escribir este libro, yo dije, esta es la oportunidad para apoyar de alguna manera a toda mi comunidad.
She said that it wasn't uncomfortable for her, the title, in terms of the degree to which it centered her, because she really wanted people to know and have some sense of understanding about what had happened to her in detention and what was still happening to women in detention and what is still happening to them now. And so she really viewed the book as an opportunity to tell her story, but also to really vocalize support and generate support for all of the other mothers who didn't have a voice because they were still in detention. And she said, when I asked her if she would be interested in writing a book, that was really the motivating force for her to agree to do that.
Thank you, Julie. Gracias, Rosy. I really love the title because it seems to invite you so personally to be empathetic as you're reading it and to enter into her story. So I was hoping that was intentional and really beautiful. We have a question from Sharon. How are events like this different with a Spanish-speaking audience in terms of the issues raised by participants?
Rosy, Sharon, le gustaría saber si hemos tenido una experiencia distinta con audiencias hispanohablantes. Y estoy tratando de recordar si hemos tenido una audiencia específicamente hispanohablante. No creo que sí. Yo sé que hemos tenido entrevistas, pero eventos como tal, yo no creo, ¿verdad?
No, solo fue así que tuvimos un meeting, pero también usted estaba inexpuesta, entonces no pudo estar esa vez y fue en español.
Sí, ajá.
Pero aparte de eso, no.
Y ese evento recibió preguntas que eran muy distintas de las audiencias no hispanohablantes.
No, fue todo normal. Bueno, casi como siempre se ha venido dando las preguntas y no ha sido fuera de lo común.
It's interesting that you asked that. I'm glad that you asked that, actually, because it made us reflect on the fact that we have not had we haven't had any events that were solely for Spanish speakers. I actually have I moderated a panel for the Texas Book Festival a few months ago that Rosy was on the panel with Francisco Cantu, whose memoir you may be familiar with. He's the guy who was the Border Patrol agent, well, he was an author before then, but turned author who wrote a memoir about his experience with the Border Patrol. Actually has a really interesting article in this week's New Yorker with Francisco Cantu and Jessica Goudreau. So there were a lot of Spanish-speaking participants, but it wasn't exclusively Spanish-speaking. A lot of our events are like this, primarily to an English-speaking audience, presumably, and conducted bilingually. I will say, though, that we have had interviews that are solely for Spanish language media.
Great.
And those have been really interesting, and the questions have been a little bit different. And yeah, that's been very interesting. And Rosy actually had an experience that was not particularly positive right after she was granted asylum. That a journalist in Guatemala picked up a story that New York One, which is a TV station here, had done about her being granted asylum and the book coming out, and sort of repackaged the story without ever contacting her or anybody else for any fact checking or quotes. And the story sort of got to Guatemala, and this is right before the book is published, and there was sort of a lot of blowback and backlash that she had to experience, and it actually caused a lot of anxiety and fear for her when we sat down together, the very day that we sat down together to review the Spanish translation of the book, which was also a fascinating experience. Was sort of when all of this online stuff was happening, where people were saying, oh, so you're going to say that our hometown is like this lawless, you know, terrible Wild West, and you're going to make us look bad internationally. And just got a lot of backlash that made her very scared, not for her, but for her family, and especially for her daughters.
Wow, that's really sad that they brought that to her like that. If you're going to share it, I wish that it would have at least been like shown to her first. But I'm very happy that she went forward with the publication despite that.
Yeah, she was, and it was another episode where I have to say, the Harper Collins Espanol team in particular was amazing, because we reached out to them and said, they actually, I think, reached out to us and said, is there anything in the Spanish language version of the book that concerns you that you may want to adjust or omit? And Rosy said that there was a piece that she wanted to omit, which I think for an English language audience is extremely important for context. She felt for a Spanish speaking audience, especially in Guatemala, it could actually be provocative and very dangerous. And so it was omitted from the Spanish translation. And there was just no pushback from HarperCollins Espanol at all. They always said, we prioritize your safety and your family's safety above everything else. And so they've really been extremely sensitive and thoughtful about that.
I'm really happy to hear that. That's good to hear about in the publishing world specifically. So hopefully other people will be comfortable telling their stories as well. I have just a quick comment that I want to make because we're having a question. Maggie is a regular attendee at our events, so I really wanted to address that for her. She said she might have a question, but she hasn't been able to read the book yet. So Hub City has not shipped the books because we're waiting for the lovely book plates to come in with the signatures. So that was mostly my fault. I apologize. But Harper has actually made specialized book plates for Rosy and Julie, and they're shipping them around New York so that everybody can sign them, and then they're shipping them back to Hub City. So after we get those book plates, then we'll be shipping out the books that you all have purchased, and then donating, of course, a portion of it to the Hispanic Alliance of Spartanburg, which was a collective idea from the three of us as we were planning this event. So we're happy to be able to support other nonprofits locally whenever we can. So thank you, Maggie, for buying a book, and we will send you your book soon. So another question I had was, well, it was mostly about your publishing experience and how long it took to write it, and you answered those already. I also wanted to ask a little bit about what made Rosy want to share her story so publicly, like what inspired her to write it, because it's not, I know that part of it was the interviews you did, but it takes a lot to tell a story like that, so she must have had some desire and some passion, and I guess a goal for sharing that story.
Rosy, Jackie le gustaría saber si tuvo otra motivación o otra inspiración para escribir el libro. Dice, aunque sí parece que sí, una de las motivaciones fue para compartir, para dar voz a las demás mujeres que no tenían voz, que sí hubo otra motivación, porque dice que debe de requerir mucho valor, mucha valentía para poder contar su historia.
Sí, hubo otra motivación y creo que para mí, bueno, es un contraste, pero sí es algo muy importante para mí. Básicamente es dar testimonio de lo que Dios hizo en mi vida, en ese momento de venir, en ese proceso, porque para mí fue un proceso. Entonces, todo lo que a mí me pasó, y aunque sí, en el libro se comenta ciertas partes, pero hay muchas cosas que igual me reservé, podría decirlo, pero sí, todo eso me impulsó a compartir mi fe en Dios. Eso fue una de las razones por las que yo decidí hablar, porque fueron cosas que fueron pasando de una manera sobrenatural, y el cambio que Dios hizo en mi vida precisamente en ese proceso. Fue otra, o sea, fueron las dos causas. Sin embargo, pues siempre digo de que la fe es algo que siempre va a estar ahí. O sea, podemos perder todo menos la esperanza, la fe de que las cosas van a cambiar.
She said, yes, there was definitely another motive, and that was primarily to give a testimony to what God has done in her life and to share her faith, because particularly in detention, but throughout her life, there have been experiences that simply felt supernatural and could only be explained by God and his work in her life.
Thank you so much, and gracias, Rosy. I have a question from Susan. She wants to ask aloud. Do you mind that?
Not at all.
Okay, go ahead, Susan.
Hi, Julie, and hola, Rosy. Because you said at the beginning of this session that everything was open, we could ask about anything. I'm going to jump into that and ask you, and this may have to do, I don't know if this has to do with what you were talking about leaving out of the Spanish edition, but one of the things I liked so much about this book, which I read like the day after Christmas, because I got it for Christmas, was that there is a lot of honesty in it, not only about Rosy's faith, but also, we begin very early with Juan Alberto and his death, his shocking death. But then later we find out, well, they weren't living together, and then there was this other boyfriend. And I think it would have been easy to think, oh, we need to win people over by presenting this perfect person. And I think it is much more interesting and important to have people be whole, real people with whole, real stories. But I wonder if you could talk about the decision, and I'm also interested to know whether your editors had any thoughts about that.
That's really interesting, and I'm so glad that you asked that. and I'm going to translate that for Rosy so she can answer, but then I would love to share some thoughts about that as well. Rosy, antes de nada voy a mencionar que Susan era mi profesora de estudios de mujeres hace muchos años ya y está con nosotras hoy. Le dice que leyó el libro el día después de Navidad porque había recibido el libro para Navidad. Y lo que más le afectó era la honestidad del libro, porque dice que comienza el libro con la muerte de Juan Alberto, pero después se entera que no estaba, que estaba con otro hombre después, y entonces dice que hubiera sido quizás más fácil esconder unos datos o unas partes de su historia o de su identidad para pintar la migrante ideal, digamos, ¿no? Entonces ella se impresionó mucho por el hecho de que estuvo completamente honesta en sus experiencias y le gustaría saber si puede hacer un comentario al respecto.
Okay. Gracias por la pregunta. Y creo que la honestidad es parte de mi personalidad y no lo puedo cambiar. Creo que para mí es algo muy importante y es algo que me ha ayudado a avanzar. Y tal vez es algo que también me ha afectado mucho en lo que ha sido mi vida, porque he sido una persona, no porque me quiera ensalzar o levantar, simplemente soy una persona honesta y creo, y quizá ese ha sido mi error, creer en todas las personas que son honestas y nos topamos con que no es así. Sin embargo, debido a esto he aprendido de que debemos aceptar a las personas tal y como son. Pero pues la honestidad es parte de mi personalidad y siempre digo, no importa qué tan duro, qué tan fuerte sea algo, creo que sacarlo y decirlo, eso te hace vivir con una libertad de ver al mundo de frente, de ver al mundo, decir, mira, esta soy yo y me aceptas, está bien, y si no me aceptas también no pasa nada, pero esta soy yo. Entonces no me gusta tapar el sol con un dedo, me gusta ser transparente y pues de esta manera valoro cada amistad, cada persona y pues así soy y agradezco mucho esta pregunta sinceramente. Para mí es muy importante también saber lo que las personas piensan al respecto de mi personalidad.
She said, thank you sincerely for the question. The honesty is part of her personality and she can't change that. That it's affected her life a lot, frankly, and she believes, and maybe it's an error, that others are too. She said, I think being honest helps you feel free because you know right away whether someone will accept you for who you are or whether they won't. And she said that she prefers that to any other way of being, and that if somebody doesn't accept her for the fullness of who she is, then that's okay too. But to know right off the bat, I think she says helps everybody feel free and feel clear about who each person is and the nature of that relationship. So I would add to that, I think that characteristic of honesty, which I was laughing because it truly is a part of her personality, is what I was really referencing earlier when I was saying that her generosity as a storyteller is so, I don't even know what adjective to use, so profound, so rich, so gratefully received, and is a gift, because I think it would be a lot easier to leave out parts of her story. And certainly given our timeline, there wouldn't have been anybody to come behind us and do any fact checking, to be honest. And so I think that level of honesty gave me a profound respect for her as a writer, as a friend, and is a continuous source of inspiration to me. Our editors didn't address that at all, but I felt so strongly and still feel one of the things that I try to do as a writer, and certainly that I've tried to do as the director of IFT, and have tried to nurture our social media person to do, is to really complicate the narrative of migration and of migrants and asylum seekers, immigrants, so that they're not these sort of ideal immigrant stories. I mean, if they are, that's great and fine, that story can exist too, but to really understand, and this has been a profound and often frustrating part of my experience as a director of IFT, particularly with white volunteers. There are a lot of people who are really not comfortable with people not being perfect, right? And none of us are perfect.
Perfect.
But one of the things that I've had a problem with, for example, is when an adult that IFT is supporting has made what my 11-year-old would call a poor choice, right? And they want me to sort of go in and be the bad cop who says, you can't do that, right? Because whatever, because thousands of people have donated money for you to be, gotten out of detention, or thousands of people have donated money for you to have an attorney or to be living in a home that's paid for by IFT. And I've said to them, all of these folks are adults with free will to make good choices or bad choices, right? And they come with this entire history to which I neither have access often and to which I have no right, frankly, right? So I don't sort of extract something in exchange for the support that's given. That's not my model. And so I've really had to try to educate folks around this notion of like, there is no such thing as an ideal immigrant, just like there's no such thing as an ideal human, right? Because we're all flawed and we all have baggage and we all make bad choices and we recover from them, or sometimes we don't, and that's okay too. That's part of the trajectory. And I had a terrible, terrible boss once when I first came to New York, and I started my master's degree in social work. I became, at a very young age, and I didn't even have my master's degree yet, the assistant director of a social services agency here. And I had this terrible boss, but the one enduring lesson that she taught me that was valuable in parenting and in running a nonprofit organization is the idea of natural consequences, right? So I don't have to come in with my baton and like wave it around and tell you that you've made a bad choice. Your own actions will lead to whatever the consequence is. And so I think what I do appreciate about Rosy, and what I appreciate about the critical response to this book, is she has allowed us and me to advance that conversation in a really gracious and beautiful and authentic way. And I think people's response to it has like been this incredible acknowledgement of that. So I'm thinking every day about how do we continue to like allow people to be human, right?
Thank you for that beautiful answer from both of you. That was really lovely. We have a question that's kind of related a little bit about the conversation around immigration. Shayna says, what does Rosy suggest ordinary Americans can do to help those still in detention? And if we've already contacted our representatives and we live too far away to help in tangible ways, what else can we do?
Rosy, Shanna le gustaría saber cuál es su sugerencia sobre los americanos ordinarios, qué pueden hacer ellos para ayudar a los que todavía se encuentran en la detención, si ya se han contactado con sus representantes y si viven demasiado lejos para ayudar de manera muy concreta.
Bueno, pienso que la forma en que, bueno, en estos tiempos, la forma en que se podría ayudar sería como el soporte económico, que ha sido algo básico para los que necesitan ese soporte económico, porque pues migración siempre pone unas fianzas muy altas. Entonces, esa sería una. Y otra de las formas sería como, bueno, tener un poco más de contacto con estas personas. Recuerdo que para nosotros era algo maravilloso cuando alguien llegaba y visitaba estos centros de detención personalmente. Algo que yo personalmente he querido hacer, aunque en estos centros de detención solo dejan entrar a menos que sea por una comunidad religiosa, que eso es lo que hacen, pero sí, es algo muy importante, porque de alguna otra manera pienso que lo demás lo tiene en las manos el gobierno. No hay mucho que se pueda hacer, sinceramente, por la comunidad que está en detención, más que el soporte económico para las personas que tienen esa probabilidad de salir bajo fianza. Entonces sería el apoyo hacia las organizaciones que están soportando esta causa.
She said the best way to help is really financial, donating to bond funds, because bonds are so expensive, and there's a whole range of bond funds that are specifically for immigrants. Some of them are geographical, some of them are topical, so there are bond funds specifically for LGBTQ folks, for example, specifically for women, specifically for Black immigrants. So if anybody's interested in that, I'm happy to send some suggestions. She said for people who may live near detention centers, although that's not often the case because they're generally put in the middle of nowhere, having more contact directly with people who are in detention is really vital. She said that it was a lifeline for women who were detained with her at Eloy to receive visits from people who are volunteers with visitation programs. And she mentioned that these are often faith-based, which has absolutely been my experience as well. It's a lot easier for people from with a religious organization to be able to get into the detention centers. And she said she really feels that the rest is in the hands of the government. I would add personally that I often get questions in these kinds of events and interviews about how to help. And I really just always emphasize that immigration is an intersectional issue with every other issue that you care about. Immigration is a mass incarceration issue. It's an education issue. It's a health access issue. And so I think whatever issue is accessible to you within your own community to work on. I will tell you that in Spartanburg, I am very excited because I am working on a project right now that is not an IFT project, although it has hints of IFT, what would I say? The beginnings of IFT and sort of the wild optimism that I had at the beginning. A friend of mine from high school, I went to Broome, got in touch with me recently, and she said, I've been following your work for a couple of years, and I'm now a teacher and a coach at Broome, and I am a mentor in this program for promising kids who want to be college bound but don't have the financial resources. And she said, I've got a couple of undocumented kids in my program. Is there anything that you can do? And I was like, well, this is kind of outside of the scope of IFT. But I said, well, tell me more. And she said, in the interim, the kid gets a half tuition scholarship. One of the kids gets a half tuition scholarship to Spartanburg Methodist. And he only needs to come up with $5,000, right? So I have the same reaction that I had at the beginning of IFT, which is like, $5,000, that's so accessible. We can make this happen. I know people, we can just, I think among my friends in Spartanburg or from Spartanburg, let's make this happen. And so we're actually working right now with the admissions and financial aid offices at SMC. We're just trying to figure out, I learned the very hard way through IFT. I had $1 million, that's not an exaggeration, come into my personal checking account between June and December of 2018. And it's been an accounting nightmare ever since. So I don't want to take any money from anybody. But what we're trying to figure out with SMC right now is whether they can set up some sort of account at the school that people can deposit funds into, or whether we can set up a trust through a local bank where the funds can be earmarked for this person's tuition. But he's a dreamer, so he has DACA status. And just today, actually, I got a $1,000 commitment from one of my oldest friends who is donating her stimulus check to his tuition. So yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of, what I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way is that there are things locally in Spartanburg, undocumented students who are who could be college bound. I just feel like $5,000 is like an easy-ish ask, right? Like you can, among a lot of people, that's the IFT lesson, among a lot of people, you can do a big thing with each person doing something little. So I definitely support Rosy's put your bucks behind it idea.
Thank you. That helps a lot, just to know there's resources locally that people can help with. There's a question, if you guys have a couple more minutes, I know it's close to the hour. There's someone else who wanted to verbalize a question for you and Rosy. Is that okay? Okay, go ahead, Britt.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both for the event. Like some of the others, I haven't been able to read the book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. I'm always on the lookout. I'm a Spanish professor at Wofford, and I'm always on the lookout for new texts that would be really current and touch really important topics like this one. So with that in mind, I'm interested in what's been removed from the Spanish version, because I do teach some classes where I could use the English version, but then often I would be using the Spanish. So I just, rather than read both and compare, I thought I'd ask you.
I was actually personally heartbroken by this piece being omitted, although I totally understand why, and obviously defer to Rosy on this, and she can speak about a little bit more about it as well. The section that was removed, there's a section in the book that I actually researched pretty heavily, and I went to Guatemala and met her family in February of 2019. And traveled part of what's called the Migrant Highway. So the chapter that's called Migrant Highway in the English edition, a huge piece of it is excised from the Spanish language edition, because that chapter starts with an incident that's really well known in her department in Guatemala, and in their sort of the equivalent of a state. Mm-hmm. And pretty much everybody there sort of knows everybody or somehow related to everybody, and she was very concerned that if framed in the way that it was in the English language edition, that it could cause harm to her family. Again, sort of like through retribution, or this idea that like you're making us look bad, or you're like sort of dredging up this this episode that really everybody else wants to cover over and forget. So, Rosy, estamos hablando de la sección del libro que lo sacaron de la edición de español, en español, y la razón para eso, Britt es un profesor de español, entonces me dice que siempre está buscando textos para compartir con sus estudiantes, y le interesaba el hecho de que habían sacado una sección del libro en la edición del español, pero le expliqué la razón por la cual. Yo no sé si quiere hablar sobre eso.
Sí, creo que básicamente esa sección, aunque es muy real todo lo que se dice en él, y, o sea, no hay nada que esconder hacia el mundo. Sin embargo, en esa pequeña sección se trata de personas que tienen una vida diferente y una mentalidad diferente. Entonces, la seguridad de mi familia es muy importante para mí. Y aunque ya se había escrito esta cápsula en inglés, al revisarla de nuevo, yo pedí que esta parte fuera removida, porque si bien en este lugar se puede leer, de esta parte del mundo se puede leer en inglés, no hay ningún problema. Sin embargo, pienso que si estas personas llegan a leer, que no tengo nada, no quiero que tomen las cosas de una manera equivocada. Entonces, con estas personas hay que ir con paso de plomo y yo no quiero exponer ya mi vida. De verdad, yo vengo con muchos traumas, muchos temores y es lo que menos quiero para mi familia. Sin embargo, sí avalo que todo lo que se dice es real. Incluso hay documentales que vienen y respaldan esto. Es fácil buscarlos en Google. Porque son cosas reales que han pasado, pero sí, esta parte fue excluida a mi petición por seguridad de mi familia.
So Rosy said that although everything in that chapter or that section of the chapter that was excised in the Spanish edition is real and factual, and that there's nothing to hide, the people that it involves and describes have a different way of thinking and acting. And so upon revising and reviewing the book in Spanish, she really felt that it could pose a threat to the safety of her family. And because she herself has already experienced so much trauma, she didn't want that possibility to come into being for them. So she requested that HarperCollins Espanol excise that part of the text.
Thank you. So, a teaching audience would still be able to follow everything, even if they're like a native English speakers, they would still follow along in the Spanish version if they're reading it.
Yeah, and she also mentioned, I'm sorry, I forgot. She also mentioned that there are documentaries that you can find easily online that really substantiate that episode that happened. So there are ways, I think what she's saying is that in the context of teaching, there are ways to absolutely like restore that and teach that in the classroom. She just didn't want people in Guatemala to be able to read it in Spanish.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your response. I think I just have one kind of wrap-up question because I don't want to keep you guys too long. But Sharon, and I was thinking about this as well, has asked if Rosy's been bitten by the writing bug. Has she thought of writing anything else, either in Spanish or with you as a co-author?
Well, I will say that I keep joking that when the pandemic began, and you can find this online, she started Facebook Live presentations primarily about cooking, and they became really popular and people loved seeing her. And so I was saying that her next book should be a cookbook. And even before that, we were joking that when she lived with Vicky, who, if you haven't read the book, you'll read about Vicky, that she lived in a full apartment, but the kitchen was not a full kitchen, and she had a hot plate. And so for a year, she cooked these incredible meals on a single burner hot plate. So I was joking she should also do a cookbook that's like one plate, one burner plate meals kind of thing. Rosy, le gustaría saber si ya se ha infectado con el virus de escribir y si quiere escribir más libros. Y le dije que mucho antes habíamos hablado de manera de chiste que debería de hacer un libro de recetas sobre la hornilla que tenía en la casa de Vicky y también de los videos de la pandemia, pero Sharon le gustaría saber si le interesa escribir más libros.
Bueno, de hecho es una pregunta que siempre me han hecho y siempre pues lo he pensado y hay algo que siempre me ha gustado leer y me ha gustado escribir pequeños párrafos, pero nunca fue como yo voy a escribir un libro y eso, nunca lo soñé. Simplemente me ha gustado plasmar ciertas cosas. Y pues si en un futuro se da la oportunidad, yo creo que sí, todavía el libro de Rosy tiene como una continuidad, porque siento que este lapso de mi vida aún no se ha terminado. Estoy todavía en un proceso, no solo de este cambio de mi vida, de venir a este país, sino también en un proceso maternal que aún no cierro. tengo mis hijas todavía en Guatemala, y entonces creo que sí hay mucho que contar detrás de esta sonrisa. Hay muchas cosas más, hay muchas cosas más. Siempre he dicho que quizá una sonrisa es el mejor disfraz que uno puede tener para enfrentarse al mundo. Sin embargo, sabemos que todos llevamos algo dentro. Entonces, hay una continuidad del libro de Rosy. Yo siento que sí la hay, cuando aún no lo hemos platicado con Julie, porque siento que esto es es algo que siempre que nos ha unido. Y entonces, sí, en un futuro, si Dios lo permite, claro que sí, va a haber una continuidad del libro de Rosy.
So she said that she's asked this question a lot and that she has always loved to read and to write, but never imagined that she would write a full book, and says that she thinks that the Book of Rosy definitely is worth having a sequel because she's still in the process of what's begun in that book, that she means that not only in terms of acclimating and building a life here, which she's very much in the process of, but also the story of her daughters and her sort of maternal, she said her maternal relationship and maternal experience, their story. They're still in Guatemala. After she was granted asylum in February of last year, she almost immediately, like a week later, started the process of bringing them here legally. But of course, because of COVID, that's kind of become completely on pause. So that story of what they've experienced since she's left and how that's been for them. And I actually met them when I went to visit her family, and their process of coming here, she feels is part of her story. And I will say, Jackie and I were talking before everybody came on about my only sadness about this book is that it happened to be launched in the midst of COVID. And I was really excited about Rosy going all across the country, which was the plan, to meet audiences and to really have reflected back to her how special her story is and how brave she is for telling that. And I think also one of the possibilities that potentially is not maybe as strong as it was that there had been talk of, we're not sure whether it was adapting the book for a young adult audience or having her sons potentially author a book from their point of view. But there were different conversations about that with our agent and with the publisher as well. So we'll see what happens.
That is so exciting. I really hope to see that more about this book come out. I don't think we have any more questions right now. I just wanted to say thank you both for coming. Thank you, Rosy, for sharing your story and your experiences. Thank you for also being willing to talk about it and beautifully sharing your experiences with us. We're all looking forward to reading the book. We've had several people in the comments say they can't wait to get their copy so they can take a look at it and talk about it. So thank you.
Le gustaría agradecerle por estar con ellos hoy y que los que no han leído el libro están ansiosos a recibir el libro y se sienten muy honrados de haber estado en su presencia para platicar en el libro y de sus experiencias.
La honrada soy yo por estar aquí con ustedes y compartir parte de mi historia y que ustedes escuchen lo que realmente pasa detrás de una vida. Yo creo que todos tenemos una historia que contar y gracias por estar aquí.
She said it was an honor to be with you this evening, and thank you for allowing her to share part of her story with you and to peel back those layers that allow all of us to sort of be who we are.
I love that so much. Well, thank you again, and thank you both. And if you have anything else to follow up with, just email me, but we really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone have a good night. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Rosy and Julie.